As soon as possible, in the months that followed the German surrender of May 1945, many Jews who had survived or remained hidden throughout the war tried to leave Europe, as once again most countries closed their borders to immigrants. The United States took some of them in. Others managed illegally to reach Palestine under the British mandate.
My parents met after the war in a refugee camp in Germany. They both wanted to emigrate to Israel. My mother even had a reservation on board the Exodus. But the organizers wouldn't let her mother go with her. They said it was too dangerous for an elderly woman. She told them, "Hitler didn't separate us, so you won't either."
On Christmas night, 1945, we arrived in Israel on a boat full of illegal immigrants on the beach at Nahariya with no authorization. They were all Holocaust refugees. They spoke only Yiddish. A lot of them were children. You should have seen them. They were each wearing 4 shirts, 3 sweaters, 2 coats, everything they owned, there on their backs. They'd come out of hell. They were the people from nowhere. I'd never seen anyone like them. They were from Auschwitz.
We knew something terrible had happened in Europe. We didn't know the details. The refugees started arriving. There was a man round our way who had a little workshop. We kids called him a million children. He didn't speak good Hebrew, but when we passed by his workshop, he'd shout out to us, "A million children. A million children like you they killed."
When I was little, there was a radio program in Israel that was on every day from 1:20 to 1:30. It was called the Family Search Department. For 10 minutes, the presenter read out a list of names of people looking for members of their family who disappeared in the Holocaust. My brother and I always listened to her while we ate our lunch. It was a kind of melody, like a litany. Rivka bat Meir of the Donovich family is looking for her brother Yossel, last seen at Treblinka. It was so sad. That melody accompanied our lunches for years. It seemed normal to us.
I had nobody in Israel, and I felt like an orphan, alone. I had no ties to anybody. They got us together, and a man came, a socialist, in a red shirt. He shouted at us kids. I guess we must have been 13 or 14. And he shouted, "Never again like lambs to the slaughter." He was saying it was all our fault. But here in Israel, we're not lambs to the slaughter. It was a kind of black humor.
We asked them, "Why didn't you defend yourselves? We Israelis, we'd have fought." We thought we were heroes. We Israelis wouldn't have let those Nazis exterminate us.
We were ashamed of being victims. Perhaps because we hadn't fought back, because they'd killed us like sheep.
We decided we shouldn't talk about the Holocaust. For years in Israel, we hardly spoke of it. It was taboo. Parents said nothing to their children about it. The children didn't dare ask questions. It was awful for the Holocaust survivors because they needed to talk. They needed someone to listen, but nobody would.
For years, there was this ideology. No Holocaust, no Shoah, no past, just the future. People interiorized it all, the victims' children as well.
It marked us. We were the sons of a people to whom something had happened, so terrible and incomprehensible, that it would always stay with us.
Once, an old man yelled out in the middle of the night in Yiddish, "Jews, help! They're going to kill us all."
In Jerusalem, you'd hear people crying out in the night, in their sleep. I didn't understand what they were saying, but they were screaming. You met people with numbers tattooed on their arms. How can you live with someone with a number on their arm? Your neighbour's tattooed with a number. What do you say to him? How do you live with Holocaust survivors? Work with them. Have fun with them. Go to the beach, to the cinema. How do you fall in love with them? How do you deal with the kids? How? There just wasn't room for all that humiliation and suffering, not for all the misery these people had endured. Perhaps they felt guilty to have survived while their family and friends had all been killed. Ben-Gurion said it. You survived because someone else died. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. A lot of people thought that the survivors were the bad ones, and the good ones all died.
How had they survived? They felt people blamed them for not being dead.
They were suspected of having done ignominious things to survive.
You can't build a new life saying to your kids that you've been treated like a floor mop, like rubbish, like a piece of shit.
This feeling that you were a wreck or that you'd been humiliated was deeply ingrained in the survivors.
They didn't want to speak, and we didn't want to hear. They were ashamed, and so were we. The trauma, the shame, the shock were all so strong that, like anyone who's been through a great trauma, they couldn't speak. They kept it all in.
People spoke about the ones who fought back, a tiny minority. But you didn't mention the rest of the Holocaust. It was taboo. That went on for nearly 15 years.
This feeling lasted till the Eichmann trial. But when they captured Eichmann, brought him back to Jerusalem and put him on trial, everything changed.
SS officer Adolf Eichmann took part in the 1942 Wannsee Conference, where 15 of the Nazi leadership set out all the precise organizational detail of the final solution. Eichmann was in charge of running the trains that took the Jews to the extermination camps in Poland. When Heinrich Himmler ordered the extermination to stop, Eichmann personally organized one last convoy to Auschwitz.
At the end of the war, Eichmann gets rid of his SS uniform, his SS identity, and his SS comrades help him to escape. They helped him to get more papers, Red Cross papers, exit visas, with his new identity, his false papers, his travel documents. He's able to get on a ship that takes him to Argentina. The German emigre community in Buenos Aires help him when he arrives in Argentina. They know that he is a wanted man, a war criminal. Then when he thinks it's safe, he arranges for his wife and his children to join him, and he buys some land and builds a house on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, and he's living there
Simon Wiesenthal was a Holocaust survivor who wanted to find Nazi war criminals and bring them to justice. This was very important to him. Eichmann was at the top of his list, since he was the highest-ranking person to have made his mark on the Jews.
Simon Wiesenthal had a great organization of informants around the world, in Jewish communities around the world. They would send him information about what they heard and what they saw.
In Argentina, a Jew found out his daughter's boyfriend was none other than Eichmann's son. Where's your father? He's over there.
And the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, finally identify him as being Adolf Eichmann.
One day, we heard it on the radio. They got Eichmann. It was a real shock.
נתגלה על ידי שירותי המודיעין בישראל אחד מגדולי פושעי הנאצים, אדולף אייכמן.
Ben-Gurion could have sent someone to Argentina to take him out. But it was the trial, more than Eichmann, that he was interested in.
The Eichmann trial was the first major event in Israel, and especially in the United States, to make genocide a separate event of the Second World War. So in that sense, it's critical, making the Eichmann trial the Jewish people's Nuremberg. It was collective therapy for the Israelis.
Nuremberg was about universal justice, a universal process. In that sense, it was very different to the trial of Adolf Eichmann. It met very different needs, and it had a very different outcome. At the opening of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, many people were shocked when Eichmann walked through a door and into the famous glass booth, because he looked like your uncle. He looked like an accountant, a small businessman, bald, spectacled, wearing a dark suit with a tie. He didn't look like the man who had sent hundreds of thousands of Jews to the death camp. Simon Wiesenthal understood that this would be the effect. Wiesenthal suggested that he should appear wearing his SS uniform.
במקום זה, בו אני עומד לפניכם, שופטי ישראל, ללמד קטגוריה על אדולף אייכמן, אין אני עומד יחידי. עמדי ניצבים כאן בשעה זו 6 מיליון קטגורים. אך הם לא יוכלו לקום על רגליהם, לשלוח אצבע מרשיעה כלפי תא הזכוכית ולזעוק כלפי היושב שם, אני מאשים. מפני שאפרם נערם בין גבעות אושוויץ בשדות טרבלינקה, נשטף בנהרות פולין, וקבריהם פזורים על פני אירופה, לאורכה ולרוחבה. דמם זועק, אך קולם לא יישמע.
The trial of Eichmann was a deeply personal thing. It was a national question. It was a way of achieving what you might call closure for the Jewish people, of giving the survivors, who were nearly half of the population of Israel, a sense that their suffering had been understood.
During the trial, people were crowding to tell their stories. This was something new for the survivors. The state needed to listen to them. Until then, they hadn't been able to speak, and nobody had heard them.
At last you could speak. The survivors could tell what had happened to them.
שנדרסו ונחנקו בתוך הקרון עצמו, נשארו עוד בפנים, מתים וחצאי מתים, וחום עצום סלל מהם, עוד הם היו חמים, איך הייתי אומר, עדים עלו מתוך הגוויות האלה.
It all started to come out at the Eichmann trial, wave after wave, like a huge torrent. It was the first time people had heard these accounts from ordinary people. In Israel, it radically changed the way the Holocaust was perceived.
They heard 110 witnesses, and not always just the fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto who told the same story. They heard just what the total dereliction of a people really was.
Alors ces malheureux enfants étaient complètement désorientés, désaxés. Il y avait beaucoup de petits-enfants, des enfants de 2, 3, 4 ans, qui ne connaissaient même pas leur nom. Les plus grands tenaient dans leurs mains la main des plus petits, pleuraient les uns les autres, ils hurlaient, et c'était affreux. Plusieurs fois, il est arrivé que les enfants commençaient à pleurer, à se débattre.
רק אשאל אותך עוד זאת, מר ולר, כשאתה ב-44 הגעת לאושוויץ, האם אז ראית עוד איזשהו מהילדים האלה בחיים?
Oh non, évidemment pas.
This myth about people not wanting to talk was comforting, obviously, because you felt less guilty. It was a way of saying, well, they didn't want to. They kept quiet about it. We'd have listened, but they didn't want to speak. The Eichmann trial meant people here rediscovered the Shoah. They were glued to their radios. At last they understood what had happened. Every night over dinner, we'd listen to this awful testimony. Suddenly, everything in Israel that we'd kept repressed came to the surface, with all the horrible details. For a child like me, it was an earthquake. That's when I really saw what it must have been like. There were intellectuals sent to follow the trial. The most famous of them, Hannah Arendt.
German philosopher Hannah Arendt was a naturalized American and a brilliant student when back in 1925 she had a passionate and reckless affair with her philosophy professor, Martin Heidegger, whose position as regards Nazism and the Jews would be an ambiguous one. She came to Jerusalem to cover the Eichmann trial, for her the very incarnation of the banality of evil. She collected her articles for The New Yorker in a controversial book called Eichmann in Jerusalem.
To Hannah Arendt, who was sitting in the audience, he appeared to be a banal, trivial figure, a boring little man. She was completely deceived by Eichmann. Eichmann adopted the persona of someone who was just a very dull bureaucrat.
He played a role, the perfect subordinate, the grey clerk, mousy, pale and bland.
Mit dem größten Widerwillen entgegengenommen und trotz meiner wiederholtesten Bitten, mich von diesen Aufgaben auszunehmen und mich von diesen Aufgaben zu entbinden, wurde seitens meines Vorgesetzten nicht entsprochen. Ich hatte diesen Befehl durchzuführen.
He wanted to give the appearance that he was stupid and boring and dull, but he was not. And there are moments during the cross-examination when Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor, gets at Eichmann, irritates Eichmann, and suddenly Eichmann's eyes flash and he becomes electrified and angry. And then you can see that Eichmann could be a terrifying and a powerful figure, But Hannah Arendt never saw those moments because she had left Jerusalem by that time.
She got it wrong. Eichmann fooled her. Hannah Arendt was at, I believe, 3 sittings of the Eichmann trial over the course of a week, but the trial itself lasted a year.
Eichmann had enormous initiative, energy. He was a very clever man. He was more than just a good servant of the Reich.
According to her, Eichmann was a little pen pusher, a mediocrity who'd never done anything, just a passive cog in the extermination machine. Listen to him, though, or read him outside the context of the trial, because you're not natural at a trial if you're trying to save your skin. But listen to him in private, in a social situation. And we can, because his friends made tapes. Friends of his, SS refugees in Argentina, exiles like him, would get together to remember the good old days, and they'd record each other, because they had this idea of writing a history of the Third Reich. Well, listen to Eichmann on those tapes, most of which have been transcribed, and you hear something else entirely.
Wenn 10,3 Millionen dieser Gegner getötet worden wären, dann hätten wir unsere Aufgabe erfüllt. Nun es nicht so ist, werde ich Ihnen sagen, dass das Leid und das Ungemach unserer noch nicht Geborenen zu bestehen haben. Vielleicht werden sie uns verfluchen.
He's not saying that he's a mediocre subordinate just following orders. He says, I helped kill 6 million of them, but I'd rather have killed 12 or 15. Then I'd have accomplished my mission and I could have died. I didn't kill enough of them.
The trial had already started when Hausner's people were able to get the recordings and the transcripts. The judges made a ruling. Only those part of the transcripts that Eichmann had written on could be admitted in evidence, but there was already enough in the material that they were able to use to condemn Eichmann by his own mouth and in his own words.
Eichmann inspected the death camps, took part in what were called special operations, in other words, gassings, and also took part in other murders, shootings.
He saw a woman holding out her child to him and begging for him to save the baby, only to see them both shot dead and to get blood over his nice leather coat.
Dort war eben der Abschluss einer Vernichtungsaktion im Gange. Ich sah, wie die Schützen hineinhielten in die Menschenmenge, die in einer Grube stand. Es ist die Angelegenheit, von der ich bereits gesagt hatte, dass ich dort sah, wie einer Mutter das Kind vom Arm weggeschossen wurde.
Also das stimmt, was es hier steht.
The prosecution wanted to prove that Eichmann had come up with the plan of the final solution to destroy the Jews. Why? Because Hausner did not have Heydrich in the dock. He could not cross-examine Himmler or Müller, and he certainly couldn't cross-examine Adolf Hitler. He had Adolf Eichmann. So he made Adolf Eichmann responsible for all of the crimes of the Third Reich. But what makes Eichmann such a horrible person is that in the end it doesn't stop him from contributing to the process of mass murder. He didn't have the excuse of saying, I didn't know. He did know. He saw it. And then, as he said in his own words, he sent the Jews to the butcher. When he was deporting trains to the east, he knew what the east meant. It meant shooting into pits. It meant gas vans. It meant pushing women and children into gas chambers.
It was over. It had been like a kind of never-ending class with 500 students following it with varying degrees of patience and taking notes the whole time. And the subject of the lesson was this sort of human spider on display behind glass to the left of the bench. Eichmann himself, there in his glass case.
Eichmann didn't understand how the court saw his crimes. He believed that he would be able to evade the death sentence in Jerusalem.
He thought he could get, if not acquitted, then just a prison sentence and not die, because normally there's no death penalty in Israel. But they made an exception for him.
Clearly, from the start, he was never going to get out alive. He would be executed.
I do feel as a historian that it was very unfortunate that Eichmann did not live for longer and speak to more historians.
I remember the day they announced Eichmann had been hanged. His body had been cremated and his ashes thrown into the sea. I heard it on the radio before I went to school, and I swore I'd never again go in the sea. I didn't want to swim in the sea his ashes were floating in.
A handful of others directly responsible for the Nazi death machine were also tried. The Treblinka trial was held in Düsseldorf in October 1964. The 10 defendants were all part of Operation Reinhardt, which killed millions of Jews in Poland. After the war, they'd all carried on with their lives. Franz Stangl, the commandant of first Sobibor, then Treblinka, had escaped justice for almost 20 years. He was arrested as he stepped off a plane from Sao Paulo on the 22nd of June 1967, at last extradited to Germany. At his trial, he was sentenced to life in prison, but brought down by a heart attack just 1 year later. It was the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal who had found him.
I was only on the first day of his trial. And he say, I feel so safe in São Paulo in Brazil. Nobody knows me. My friends say, and one day Wiesenthal will take you, and I smile.
It's appalling that Germany had the possibility during the 60s and 70s of putting Nazis on trial. They had hundreds of written documents that couldn't be denied, so they knew just what those Nazi criminals were up to.
We tracked down, well, at least we did everything we could to bring certain criminals to justice.
That was always my aim, to find out where they were.
Klaus Barbie, ex-head of the Gestapo at Lyon, had tortured many members of the resistance and executed many of them. On the 6th of April 1944, he rounded up 44 Jewish children from a children's home. 42 of them were murdered at Auschwitz, the other 2 in Estonia. After the liberation of France, Barbie, wounded, made it back to Baden-Baden in Germany.
Klaus Barbie took the so-called Rat Line, which was an established escape route that involved, among other things, certain representatives of the Catholic Church. The French requested his extradition. He was wanted for war crimes. The US government decided that it could not return him or give him over to the French intelligence services because they were afraid that the French intelligence services had been infiltrated and controlled by the Soviets. So instead of giving him over to the French, Klaus Barbie was recruited and hired and paid by American military intelligence, the Counterintelligence Corps.
In 1971, Beate and Serge Klausfeld, after much searching, managed to track Klaus Barbie down in Bolivia, hiding under the name Klaus Altmann.
There was a showdown. Pompidou didn't want to ask for extradition. I remember saying, there, we know where Klaus Barbie is, what identity he's living under. There he is. I'm giving you the information. Demand his extradition.
Klaus Barbie faced trial in Lyon in 1987. He was sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity. He died 4 years later of cancer. It was the last trial of a leading Nazi. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, which hunted down Nazi criminals, launched for the first time in Germany a poster campaign, Operation Last Chance. Below a photo of the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau were the words, "Late but not too late." Millions of innocents were murdered by Nazi war criminals. Some of the perpetrators are free and alive. Help us to bring them before a court. The poster promised up to €25,000 to anyone whose testimony would lead to the jailing of a former Nazi.
After all those years, they wanted to catch a few old men of over 90 who'd be dying soon. Now they decide to look for them? Why didn't they do it earlier?
They're dead. The big criminals are dead. They were at least 30, so add 70 more to that, they're all gone. There are a few little dog bodies left who were 20, 25 at the time, and now they're 90, 95.
The attempt to locate, to investigate, to prosecute men who are alleged to have committed Nazi war crimes now is too late. It's too late because these men are too old. You cannot put men who are 90 years old or older on trial.
Some say they should be judged right up till their last breath.
Trials now are a waste of time, resources, energy, and they have a potential backlash. It's possible to see them not as justice but as vengeance.
The problem will be solved soon because there'll be no one left.
The shocking thing when you travel in Eastern Europe is the sense that the entire continent is a cemetery. It's a startling experience. Terrible. There's a total emptiness at the heart of these places. It's so shocking because it's still as if they had just been taken away. You know, the towns are like ghost towns.
Żyjemy w tej chwili w kraju. All around us in this country are the ghosts of the ones who were here before. In Lodz, there were 230,000 Jews. Today, there are 300. We're living with those ghosts.
Every town in Poland has two things if you're traveling around. There's this empty town square because all the businesses were Jewish. And it's still empty. There's still no businesses in the shops from when they took away the Jews in 1941. Just incredible. And there's a mass grave, right? Where the people who used to be in the square are now in the grave, right? And that's what it's like to go travel in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Poland, in Latvia, in Lithuania. It's all the same.
It's shocking when you go to Krakow. In a way, you feel like you've wandered onto a film set. All that tourism they built around the memory.
Even in the shtetls, there's no trace left of any Jews. What there is a sort of restoration of the memory of Jews.
Some of it's more like Disneyland and the real pre-war days. But then they're making an effort to bring back something that's gone.
People who come to Krakow and who are interested in learning something about the Jewish past instead of learning about the real thing, as they can. They want to know about how Schindler's List was filmed.
You can see the billboards in Krakow, guided tours of Auschwitz or Krakow, Wajka, Auschwitz. It's package tours. Unfortunately, that's how it is. I don't think it's right. I reckon visits to the extermination camps should be handled differently. They're tourist attractions, but that won't change.
Auschwitz mustn't become a tourist curiosity. or people will just be coming to have their photo taken in front of the Arbeit macht frei sign.
You can't help wondering if it's turning into a Holocaust industry.
For ordinary Polish people, I don't think the Jews matter very much. They're nearly invisible. They have some memories of a Jewish existence in Poland, and they know that the Jews are big business, good business.
In Krakow, just 60 kilometers from Auschwitz, tourists can buy, under the counter, a bottle of Sarah or Solomon vodka, records of klezmer Jewish music, and all kinds of other reminders of the good old days, including wooden puppets of rabbis with hook noses.
So why not have little wooden rabbis and Schindler tours? It's business.
Grossman, in his film, you know, there's that scene I'll never forget where he's talking to these Polish ladies with babushkas and silver crowns, and they're saying, oh yes, you know, the poor Jews, they were all rich, they had all the money. And as he's interviewing, they're repeating the same cliches and the same anti-Semitic cliches that they grew up with.
The local population would look with quite sympathetic eye on what's going on, saying that Hitler is a swine and a bandit. But for one thing, we will have to thank him in the future, namely for the fact that he removed Jews from Poland. This is a very common statement during the war. The mourning for Jewish neighbors, for the Jewish population that lived in these places. The whole story of mourning Jewish dead is still something that needs to happen in Poland. This hasn't happened yet.
According to figures published by the Foundation for the Memory of the Shoah, over 1,000 survivors died every month.
The big problem with the Holocaust is that the survivors are all gradually disappearing with time.
Very shortly, there will be no one left who will be able to speak in the first person who experienced the events of the Holocaust. Survivors are dying at an alarmingly increasing rate, and at some point in the next decade or so, there won't be any survivors left who can talk with authority about what they saw themselves. So what's left? Well, what's left? Who's left to tell the stories?
These days, we've got maybe 100,000 videos of Holocaust survivors. But I can't ask questions to a film. The direct contact with the survivors, the ones who were there, is so precious. They are the only ones who can tell us the true story from the point of view of the victims. When they've gone, it'll be even harder for us to comprehend what happened.
How are we to preserve the memory of what happened back then? We need the testimony of books, of historical research. A lot of people have done a very good job, but there's something only art can give us. The feeling that we can identify with it all.
It was literature that saved Napoleon and his Russian campaign from oblivion, thanks to Tolstoy's War and Peace. Otherwise, who'd remember what happened to Russia in 1812? Literature is the best way of preserving memories for the centuries to come. I get a lot of letters from the children of Holocaust survivors. The letters all move me very much. My mother, whom I love so much, survived the Shoah. She's told us very little, hardly anything. Now I understand what an extraordinary woman she was. Why didn't I see it? I never understood what Holocaust survivors carried within them. How could I have been so blind?
There's something awful going on in Israel. We treat Holocaust survivors very badly, and they're elderly people. The state doesn't give them enough aid. Some of them live in very tough conditions. The state doesn't give them enough because they don't have a strong enough pressure group. It gives them a bit more now, but only because of a big demonstration in Jerusalem. Why should these old people have to fight for it? There are still 250,000 Holocaust survivors in Israel. 1,000 of them are dying every month. They went through hell. Give them what they need. It'll cost less and less because they're all passing on. There are Holocaust survivors here who don't have enough to eat. It's crazy. I went to see one of them at the station. He'd been in the gulags in Russia. Then he came here, so he got no compensation from Germany. The state should look after the survivors. It was they who founded the state.
It's shameful that the camp survivors living in Israel are humiliated and hungry. It's a permanent stain on the state of Israel.
They're going through it all again, the Holocaust survivors who came to Israel. No one wants to listen to them today either. One day, my son, Jonathan, came back from school. He was 3. It was the Shoah Memorial Day. In Israel, the sirens go off, and everyone stops for a minute's silence. He came home confused and upset and asked me, "Daddy, what happened? Who are these Nazis? Why did they kill us?" I was furious that the teacher told such little children about it. I didn't want to talk to him about it. I felt that if this naive, fragile child found out what men were capable of doing to their own kind, he'd never be the same. In a way, he'd no longer be a child. I spoke about it very little to protect him. Myself, when I think about that terrifying mystery of human behavior, the infinite strength of evil, its unique character, I feel I could go mad.
In meiner Kindheit und Jugend ist eigentlich in den Schulen nicht sehr viel.
In my childhood, we didn't talk much in school about the crimes of the Nazis.
Aber es blieb im Grunde genommen sehr undifferenziert. Also
we mention them, but just in passing.
Und es gab furchtbare Verbrechen.
There were horrible crimes committed in the war.
In Osteuropa und
in Eastern Europe, the war was terrible, and Germans killed Jews.
Und welche einzelnen Schritte dazu nötig
But nobody asked what really went on, how it was done, what our neighbors did, or our family. When I was little, The Nazis and the Jews were like two vanished species. It had all happened so long ago.
Our teacher told us we'd been brainwashed. To begin with, we didn't understand, but then we found out he wasn't allowed to teach history beyond the Middle Ages, because he'd been a Nazi during the Third Reich. He could teach history, but only ancient history and the Middle Ages.
For us children, all that seemed to have happened centuries ago.
How easy it is to pass on by without knowing that each of these little plaques represents someone who was deported and killed in a concentration camp just for being a Jew, a gypsy, a communist, a homosexual, or handicapped.
Also zum Beispiel, ich weiß nicht, ob Sie das kennen, die Stolperstein-Initiative, die in
Stolperstein's idea of the little stones you can trip over plays an important role in German cities. They're little commemorative plaques set in the pavement with the names on them of people who'd lived there, mostly Jews, along with the date they were deported and when they died. Some people think that's going too far and that we should have moved on long ago.
Non-Jews tend to think it's too much. They say Jews never stop talking about the Shoah.
Everyone knows the word Shoah now. I've heard talk of the cow Shoah. Vegetarians talk about it. The Shoah of the cattle. The word's everywhere. Everything's a Shoah. The abortion Shoah, the animal Shoah, the economic Shoah. Everything's a Shoah.
Germans say, do we have to carry the cross of Auschwitz until the end of time? Enough.
Some people probably don't want to hear about the historical crimes their country has committed.
There's an expression now in Germany, I'm tired of the Holocaust. That's enough. It's over. We're the third generation.
If you try to talk about it in schools, they get impatient. They say, yeah, we've been over it 5 times already. We know the story.
Sure, I have students who think we go on about it too much, that there's too much media exposure.
Even in Israel, some people say, I've heard enough about it. It's understandable. Who wants to hear about the Holocaust all the time?
It has also numbed them. It's made them insensible.
So you say to the children, you have to learn this history, or else we could all become Nazis or whatever. So we teach you about good and evil.
The Shoah isn't a civil education lesson about tolerance, the rights of man, or anti-racism. The Shoah is much more complex than that.
We should always be just speechless, indignant, scandalized, horrified when we hear this story. And my fear is that it becomes normalized, that this abnormal story becomes normal.
It took a whole generation, in Israel and elsewhere, for us to start to take in what had happened. It's an open wound. Bit by bit, you learn to face it.
There's a document that tells about a Jewish soldier in the Dutch army in 1940 when the Germans invaded his country. He lost both legs and ended up in a wheelchair. When they were rounding people up for Auschwitz in 1943, he was called in. He wrote to a senior German officer in Holland asking not to be sent to Auschwitz because of his condition. A clerk sent back his letter with, written on it in red, Yud ist Yud, ob mit oder ohne Beine. A Jew is still a Jew, with or without legs. You shall be deported because we have to destroy Judaism. Incredible. A Jew still a Jew, with or without legs.
I would say in the Holocaust, what separates it from most of these is the degree to which the Jewish threat that Hitler is destroying is so totally imaginary, is totally a fantasy in his own mind. The notion that somehow Germany is threatened if you don't kill a 2-year-old Jewish baby in the Ukraine is total fantasy. The notion that this is an infection, a bacillus that you must treat in the way that if there is any remnant left, then we haven't accomplished the goal. This disparity between the drastic measure of killing 6 million people and the fact that virtually none of those people posed any threat whatsoever to Hitler and the Germans.
For Jews, Germany will never be a normal country. And I don't think Germans will ever feel normal because of history. The Germans cannot escape their history. Not just the crimes against the Jews, but the destruction of democracy. Germany will always, in some way, bear the mark of Cain, will always be associated with the Nazi era, the Nazi atrocities. It will never be a normal country, but that may be a good thing because it will be a warning, a lesson.
You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find warm food and friendly faces when you return home. Consider if this is a man who works in mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies by a yes or no. Consider if this is a woman without hair, without name, without the strength to remember. Empty are her eyes, cold her womb, like a frog in winter. Never forget that this has happened. Remember these words, engrave them in your hearts, when at home or in the street, when lying down, when getting up. Repeat them to your children. Or may your houses be destroyed. May illness strike you down. May your offspring turn their faces from you.